They are portraits of violence. Stories from the American past that reveal much about this country's current wave of violence. Gruesome, mostly forgotten images of violent acts that keep repeating themselves again and again and again. America didn't invent violence. The human animal itself is violent. But, over time, as this country became the world's greatest and freest democracy, it also became the most violent of all developed nations. Through pictures, it's possible to see how guns became such a part of this country's culture, how armed and dangerous gunslingers from years ago still fit the profile of today's violent offenders, and how the media not only has had a long tradition of turning outlaws into heroes, but a long tradition of showing graphic violence in a way that shaped today's violent tabloid journalism. Violence is habit-forming, and America is addicted. A wife, photographed in death, reveals how domestic violence has been permitted to go on for centuries. A court-ordered photograph of a battered 10-year-old tells the story of how child abuse was first uncovered in this country. Through 8 historical portraits, we will see how this country's violent habits first started and why they resurfaced generation after generation. It is called the cycle of violence, and it is impossible to break its grip without first traveling back in time. To see for ourselves the violent traditions that we unknowingly have carried with us through the centuries. Indians were the first victims of violence in America. Looked upon by white settlers as nothing more than savages, Native Americans were up against a brand of violence that was imported here from Europe. A tradition of attacking groups seen as inferior to whites. For generations, Americans have refused to acknowledge that our nation's first hero was actually a violent man who believed in white supremacy.
On the first island which I found, I took some natives by force. They do not bear arms and do not know them. We could make them do whatever we want. But if you discover that some among them steal, you must punish them by cutting off nose and ears, for those are parts of the body which cannot be concealed.
Columbus's type of violence caught on fast in the New World. By 1542, just 50 years later, 250,000 Indians had been exterminated, the entire Arawak tribe he had first encountered.
In order to inflict that terrible type of violence, one thing is sometimes necessary: to look upon the victims as being less than human. Then it can be justified. It can be rationalized in the same way that people would think nothing of squashing a bug on the sidewalk because it's not human.
Generation after generation, as white America expanded, Indians were hunted down. Entire tribes were wiped out. Without knowing it, white America was forming deeply rooted violent traditions that have continued to haunt this country ever since. Indians had their own ancient traditions of brutality, including scalping and the mutilation of enemies. As Indians struck back, white retaliation grew more intense. And as each side was attacked, took revenge, and then was attacked again, the first true cycle of American violence was born.
There was suddenly heard a shot and a blood-curdling yell, and the Indians were seen riding at full speed directly towards the horses. They kept circling and hallooing, bullets whizzing through the camp. None can know the horror of it.
For generations, history books taught American children that the Indians were the attackers, that white settlers were simply defending themselves. But the statistics told the real story. By 1890, the Indian population, which numbered 2 million at the time of Columbus, had been cut down to just 300,000. After centuries of bloody warfare, Indians would suffer their final defeat at a place called Wounded Knee. No episode in the long history of attacks against the American Indian was more clearly preserved than this, the very last. It began in January 1889, during a total eclipse of the sun. A Paiute shaman named Hezakya entered a trance and beheld a vision.
When the Great Spirit comes this way, whites can't hurt Indians then. If all Indians dance everywhere and keep dancing, then all dead Indians will come back and live again.
Ghost dancing was a peaceful ceremony designed to summon the spirits of lost ancestors, a new Indian religion that spread like a grass fire from tribe to western tribe. Whites feared the ghost dance was a war dance, and that misunderstanding now led to the last major confrontation.
Indians are wild and crazy over the ghost dance. We're at the mercy of these crazy demons. We need the military, and we need them at once.
Under the authority of President Harrison, thousands of troops were sent into South Dakota, where a large group of ghost dancers had gathered to worship. On December 29, 1890, before any confrontation had erupted, the Great Sioux Chief, Bigfoot, and his peaceful ghost dancers surrendered to the U.S. cavalry.
Bigfoot, with all the others, women, children, and some old men, went along with the soldiers to Wounded Knee Creek.
The men were separated from their families, from their teepees, and taken to a certain spot. Then a nobody among the bunch of Indians fired his gun.
As soon as this shot was fired, the Indians began drawing their knives. Then the firing began on the part of the soldiers.
The people who were standing immediately around the young man who had fired the first shot were killed right together. Then they turned their Hotchkiss guns upon the women who were in the lodges. Women fleeing with their babies were killed together, shot right through. Little boys, as soon as they came in sight, a number of soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there.
Men and women were heaped and scattered all over the floor at the bottom of the little hill. When I saw this, I wished I had died too. The wind came up and it grew very cold. A heavy snow began to fall.
In the bitter cold, the chilling images were photographed by local newspapermen who had arrived on the snowy scene armed with a camera. A mass grave was filled with the bodies of more than 250 Native American men, women, and children. Here, at last, was undeniable photographic evidence of the brutal traditions that shaped the early American character and still today underlie this country's violent nature. Over the years, the targets of violence continued to be groups seen by whites as less than human. Now the victims were African Americans instead of Native Americans.
The situation of black and red peoples has to do with the ways in which the practice and ideology of white supremacy branded them not only as less than human, but degraded black and red bodies in order to exploit them economically, to oppress them politically, and to dishonor them culturally. And violence has been one of the means through which that has taken place. And of course, if you're convinced that a group of people are less than human, then the violence that you inflict will lead you to conclude that maybe their pain is less important or of less value than your pain. And that's part and parcel of American history.
Early America was the world's first gun country. Here rifles were needed for hunting and for protection, and Americans got good at using them. The founders of America saw the private gun as an ally of freedom, the key to being able to count on an army made up of citizens who could use their own guns in times of national crisis.
The American Revolution was a model for later American violence because it was possibly the greatest example of the use of violence in what was perceived by the patriots that the end justifies the means. The means being violence and the end being independence.
Citizens used their own guns to win the Revolutionary War and establish a free democracy. And Americans' right to bear arms would be protected by law under the Second Amendment. But in less than a century, Americans turned their guns upon each other. The Civil War was the greatest outburst of violence this country has ever known. And the Battle of Antietam remains the single bloodiest day in American history. 23,000 were killed, wounded, or missing, nearly half the number of casualties during the entire Vietnam War. But here, lost during the course of just 12 hours. It was the only time Americans have fought Americans. For many soldiers, violence became second nature. The adrenaline rush on the battlefield was addictive, and all too often, aggressive young males went out of control. For men like Bloody Bill Anderson, the war was simply an excuse to kill. He was a member of Quantrill's Raiders, an undisciplined and hard-drinking band of Confederate marauders whose specialty was slaughtering innocent citizens in their homes. It was a violent gang not unlike the gangs that haunt America today.
Citizens of Missouri, I will hunt you down like wolves and murder you. You cannot escape.
When the Civil War ended, many veterans went home addicted to violence, still carrying their army weapons which they were permitted to purchase from the government. Handguns were incredibly popular, and gun manufacturers were flooding the market with personal weapons. Like today, there were almost as many guns in this country as people. And for the first time, Americans would have to cope with a generation of armed and aimless young men still hungry for violence.
In every society for which we have any record, today or in the distant past, young males have been disproportionately the perpetrators of violence.
We've got to look specifically at the way men are raised. And especially for young boys who are at the age where they must identify with masculinity and manhood in order to become healthy adults, our equating violence with masculinity causes them to be at risk for violence.
If youth and maleness and the availability of guns are all factors associated with violence, a fourth is this country's addiction to alcohol. Just as it still is today, alcohol was involved in more than half of all violent crimes. In mining towns, where men outnumbered women 100 to 1, and where a settlement of 5,000 often had as many as 50 saloons, armed whiskey-drinking men killed each other at 20 times the murder rate of the big eastern cities. Early American law actually encouraged men to fire back in self-defense. It was a uniquely American brand of violence that was called no duty to retreat, where a two-sided gunfight was considered justifiable homicide. Case after case was settled in favor of those who chose to shoot and kill instead of peacefully retreat. A century later, a store owner has a gun behind the counter and aggressively goes on the offensive during a robbery. It's a modern-day example of no duty to retreat, and it's just part of America's violent tradition. By the late 19th century, the Wild West was the place where another aspect of America's brand of violence began, an obsession the media has had to glamorize violence by turning armed and dangerous outlaws into folk heroes. And if any story illustrates this tradition, it is the story of Frank and Jesse James. Trained as guerrilla fighters with Quantrill's raiders during the Civil War, the James brothers' specialty was daring daylight bank robberies and cold-blooded murder. The public was both horrified and titillated by the young gunslingers, and an appetite for stories about the James gang became voracious, as their capers were glamorized by popular novels, newspapers, even songs.
Jesse James was a lad, he killed many a man. He robbed the Glendale
The Kansas City Times wrote, "They are so daring and utterly in contempt of fear, we are bound to admire the crime and revere its perpetrators."
American society, at the very least, is ambivalent. That is, on the one hand, they don't want violence to happen to them. On the other hand, they love to watch it. They're excited by it. They're titillated by it. They're thrilled by it.
And it was thrilling for the James brothers, too, who took special delight in taunting the press.
We are not thieves. We're bold robbers. Detectives have been trying for years to get a large reward offered for me, dead or alive. And the same for Frank James. We will never be taken alive.
Then came 1876 and an ill-fated attack on the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota.
Frank admitted he had a quart of whiskey which he and Pitts and Bob drank before going into the bank. Had we known about the whiskey, the whole ghastly affair would never have occurred.
Cashier! Open that safe goddamn quick or I'll blow your head off.
It can't be opened right now. There's a time lock on it.
That's a lie. Let's cut his fucking throat.
Frank James then leaned over the desk and placed his revolver at Haywood's head. Then he fired, killing him instantly.
Outside, one by one, each member of the James gang was either killed, wounded, or captured as they tried to make their getaway. Only the James brothers escaped. But Jesse James wasn't invincible, and like so many outlaw heroes, he died young. In 1882, he was shot in the back for reward money.
Oh, the people held their breath when they heard of Jesse's
By
death.
then, he was a full-blown American legend. And for years after his death, his brother Frank charged admission to his home, to a public that couldn't get enough of him. An American tradition of turning violent men into heroes and profiting from their violence was now firmly in place.
Americans make heroes out of violent persons who themselves often identify with the underdog. Common folk up against arbitrary power.
Just 30 years later, the violent frontier was shifting to fast-growing cities. And the media's attention shifted too, from outlaws like Jesse James to a new breed of folk hero, the gangster. Instead of horses, America's new role models used fast cars that could take bullets, and like Quantrill's raiders, would kill without mercy. The brutal individual the public now chose to idolize was Al Capone. He became a media darling, impressing reporters with his wit and his wealth. One reporter wrote, "It is not because Capone is different that he takes the imagination. It is because he is so gorgeously and typically American." He was even called on by Hollywood as a gangster movie consultant. Once again, the man America chose to idolize was also one of the most savage men in American history, responsible for more than 500 deaths, a destroyer of anyone who stood in his way. But it was a single event that would turn Capone into an enduring symbol. It occurred on Valentine's Day in 1929. 5 of Capone's men, dressed like police, pulled up in front of a competing bootlegging headquarters. Pretending they were conducting a routine bust, they entered the building and ordered 7 mobsters to line up against a wall.
Suddenly I heard a round of shots that almost deafened me. I ran to the window and saw the men.
All 7 were cut down by machine gun fire. With fast, new printing presses, shots of the bloody massacre were immediately published nationwide. Several years earlier, the New York Daily News had published a picture of the electrocution of Ruth Snyder for the murder of her husband. A reporter had sneaked in a camera strapped to his ankle, and the media learned an important lesson. Shocking images sold papers. Over the course of the next decade, a rash of media-conscious outlaws enjoyed the publicity and courted the press. Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, Ma Barker and her boys, Bonnie and Clyde. Theaters offered authentic news coverage, usually mixed with action-packed recreations. It was not modern tabloid television that first blurred the line between fact and fiction, but these early newsreels.
These photographs of the outlaws are being circulated by the police through the Southwest to aid in their identification. The girl always carries at least 2 guns. With Barrow, she's accused of another killing after that of the motorcycle cops that Schieffer described.
One was standing on either side of the car. They reached down and got the gun and came up when there was about 10 feet away and says, boom, 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 boom.
By the time of their final shootout, the media was even allowed to film Bonnie and Clyde's bodies, still inside their getaway car, riddled with bullet holes. Bonnie and Clyde had become so glamorized, their funerals were attended by thousands of fans. Ever media conscious, Bonnie even wrote her own newsreel eulogy.
In the last few words of Bonnie's own poem, which she penned before her death, to a few it means grief. To the law, it's relief. But it's death to Bonnie and Clyde.
Dateline, Chicago, July 22nd, 1934. In a moment, the story.
The media has always looked for a new story that could top the last one, and they found it in the notorious bank robber and killer, John Dillinger.
John Dillinger, Prince of Crime. Chains, guards, and locked.
An entranced public followed every move of a massive manhunt for the man known as Public Enemy Number 1. Fittingly, he was standing in line to see a gangster movie when federal agents spotted him under the marquee lights.
I recognized Dillinger as soon as he appeared near the theater. He saw me give a signal to my men, became alarmed, reached into a belt, and was drawing a .38 pistol when 2 of the agents let him have it.
Officials at the city morgue were so caught up in the media frenzy, they even allowed the public in. Long lines of fans filed past the corpse for a final look at America's folk hero, dead on a slab at age 31. In the papers the very next day, an unknown young killer proclaimed, "I'm the new Dillinger." And like today, the media was criticized for glamorizing violence and encouraging copycat criminals.
I think, again, you're talking about a whole American cultural phenomena. And we're talking about major heroes who were people who knew how to wield guns. These types have been elevated to heroes. And in fact, some kind of epitome of manhood because of their ability to use weapons and to blow people away.
By the 1960s, Americans got their first taste of violence on television. On July 13, 1966, a 24-year-old drifter named Richard Speck brutally attacked and killed 8 student nurses. Now the coverage was instantaneous, in America's living rooms as soon as the crime scene was discovered.
The early morning discovery of the murder of 8 student nurses shocked Chicago and the nation. Commissioner Andrew Toman called it the crime of the century. A 23-year veteran of the police force said, "I've seen all kinds of murders. All of them don't add up to this."
Starting with the Speck murders, the media learned it could hold on to a large audience by hyping the threat of random violence and making ordinary Americans feel they were no longer safe in their own homes. Then, as if to confirm that fear, just 2 weeks later, a sniper named Charles Whitman went on a 90-minute shooting spree. And this time, the media went one step further, broadcasting the violence as it unfolded on live television.
This is a live camera on the tower of the University of Texas in Austin.
Both of those crimes sensitized Americans to mass killing carried out by individuals. And although there had certainly been examples of mass killing before, it didn't become the sort of current phenomenon which it has been ever since.
In America today, accused violent criminals, especially white criminals, are still treated by the media and by the public as celebrities. Serial killers and mass killers have replaced the outlaw and the gangster as the latest media obsession. And the more unspeakable the crime, the larger the audience. Having looked back at the media's long fascination with America's fiercest individuals, it's not surprising that these killers get more than their share of publicity. The fact is, they actually commit just 1% of all homicides. Over the course of our history, more than 60 million immigrants have come to America seeking their destiny.
I came to America because I heard that the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I found out 3 things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them.
For the majority of early immigrants, life in America brought a host of new miseries, including prejudice. For as the Indians had been before them, immigrants were perceived by many as inferior to white native-born citizens.
The new immigration contains a large and increasing number of the weak, the broken, and the mentally crippled of all races, drawn from the lowest stratum. The whole tone of American life has been lowered and vulgarized by them.
Most new immigrants found themselves unemployed and at the bottom of the nation's economy. Frustrated, many turned violent. Throughout the 1830s and 40s, English and Irish immigrants comprised more than 50% of the prisoners in urban jails. By the 1920s, Italian immigrants were 20 times more likely to be imprisoned for murder than those from other ethnic groups. And with each successive wave of immigrants, a new ethnic group took its turn as America's most wanted. Instead of attacking the rich and privileged, oppressed and angry immigrants turned their fury upon each other. But homicide among immigrants has always subsided after a generation or two, after people have fought and struggled to enter the mainstream of society and make decent livings. In striking contrast, there is one group that has never been absorbed into the industrial labor force and has been unable to break the cycle of racism and poverty: underclass African Americans.
Immigrant groups were coming over here and making it when black people were still segregated in the South. So that we have to not pretend as if we have a level playing field and that blacks are like immigrants. It's just not so. immigrants, particularly if they're white immigrants, at least they're white people. You see, and that counts for something in terms of being able to make headway in American society.
Race hatred is the cancer within the American democratic dream. It began with slavery.
The Negro will not work unless compelled to by a master of the white race. If left to themselves, within 20 years they would become as barbarous as their African ancestors.
What you would get in 244 years of chattel slavery, of inheritable and perpetual slavery, is an institutional form of violence in which the whip and other forms of other kinds of instruments were used to ensure that a labor force was dependent and disciplined and to be perpetuated over time. So it is true that the violence was quite real.
In 1866, just 1 year after the abolition of slavery, came the formation of this country's oldest hate group, the Ku Klux Klan. Klan members called themselves ghouls and claimed to be the ghost of slain Confederate soldiers.
We are opposed to Negro equality and in favor of a white man's government of this country. We are in favor of the restitution of the Southern people to all their rights.
The Klan forced America to realize that freedom of speech, one of the principles that made this country so great and unique, also guaranteed individuals the right to spread their message of hate.
And every one of us, we still will not mix up with a bunch of black savages.
Lynching first occurred in this country. It is an American invention, part of our long-standing tradition going all the way back to Columbus, of attacking groups seen as being inferior to whites. From the late 1860s to the early decades of the 20th century, mostly in the South, thousands of black men were hunted down, tortured, and killed by white mobs. Almost always the excuse was a suspected rape.
One of the things most likely to provoke white male violence against black men is something that has to do with a white woman. And so that it wasn't just lynchings because black men raped. Sometimes they were lynched when nothing took place, that became the excuse that they knew they could get away with for murdering someone for some other reason.
That's what happened here in Omaha, Nebraska in 1919. The scene of a lynching that was not only photographed, but reported in detail by the local press. Here, racial tension was high, following a series of rapes of white women, reportedly by black men. The situation came to a climax on September 25th, as midnight rang in. 19-year-old Agnes Lobeck, a young white woman, said she was raped on her way home from the movies and identified her attacker.
The minute the police brought him here, I recognized him. I knew him from his hat and from his clothes and his shoes and from his face and his size.
Though he insisted on his innocence, Will Brown, a black packing house worker, was charged with the crime. He awaited trial, jailed inside the Douglas County Courthouse. Here, on Sunday, September 28th, a mob began to assemble. There were reports that free liquor was being handed out to the crowd of 15,000 by whites hoping to incite the mob. At 5 p.m., fueled by alcohol, the mob attacked the court building. Men began scaling the walls, trying to enter by window. At 8 p.m., the building was set on fire.
A man in a policeman's blue uniform threw down a note. It read, "Come up and you will get the Negro." The three of us went up there, and from behind the fog of smoke, Somebody handed the nigger to us.
Beaten unconscious on the way down, Brown was stripped of all his clothing. His body would be filled with more than 1,000 bullets.
We are going to teach these fiends a lesson. The white people of this town are tired of putting up with them. If the county won't do justice, then fire will.
An Omaha newspaper photographer captured the grisly scene, the charred remains of Will Brown. The townspeople boldly posed for the camera before a trophy of their own violence, passing a hatred deep within each of them, from one generation to the next. Almost everyone was smiling. Vigilantism is a unique American tradition, part of a long history of mob justice. And over the centuries, lynching has come in many forms, claimed many lives.
Violence is not the way. We are hit, we've got to learn not to hit back.
The main thrust of the black movement has always been nonviolent, and of course that's represented ultimately so well in the struggles of Martin Luther King Jr. Remember, one of the things that stirred up the American people to redress some of the wrongs is watching television and seeing a lot of the whites in the South clobbering black children and setting dogs on children and so on who were trying to go to school.
Six days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles.
By August 1965, with the Watts Rebellion, you do get something relatively new. You get a level of black self-assertion in the form of violent rebellion that it becomes offensive rather than defensive. I think what you have there is rising expectations being frustrated and hopes being broken and dreams being deferred, and the rage spilling over in a violent manner. But alongside that, one still has everyday violence in the black community in which most black criminal activity is targeted to black victims. Unfortunately, of course, that everyday violence has been increasing and reaching absurd levels.
If you look at urban, poor communities, you usually find communities with very high homicide rates. It seems, because obviously most poor people are not violent, it seems that the stress and anxiety of poverty, coupled with maybe greater television watching, coupled with maybe the lack of an adult male parent for some of those children, seems to contribute to those risk factors.
Over the last 30 years, inner-city blacks, comprising less than 3% of the nation's total population, have committed nearly half of all murders. And most of the victims of violent crime also are black and poor. African Americans are murdered at 5 times the rate of whites.
Poor blacks kill each other annually than were killed in the entire history of lynching. It is settling disproportionately on the poor, on African Americans. We must break this cycle.
It's no accident that we've seen the escalation of black-on-black homicide, given the shattering of bonds of affection and networks of support. White supremacy, male supremacy in terms of domestic abuse, has to do with mean-spiritedness and cold-heartedness. And there's no doubt that we have seen an increase of the mean-spiritedness and cold-heartedness in American civilization.
It is now recognized that for generations, behind a portrait of marital bliss, all too often lurked men with short tempers and violent tendencies. Americans didn't invent violence against women, but they took to it with vengeance. In Puritan New England, Women were routinely whipped and publicly humiliated. Married women were little more than the property of their husbands. For generations, Americans have reported more domestic abuse than any other industrial nation. Alcohol, the catalyst for so much violence in American history, surfaced again. Women actually prayed in front of saloons in an effort to close them down, after the temperance movement made the connection linking alcohol abuse with domestic violence. Still, there were no laws in place to stop abusive, alcoholic husbands.
One night I was on my post and I heard a woman shouting murder. I went to the house. She had been beaten by her husband, who was lying on the floor half drunk. All I could do was caution the man to keep quiet, and then I left the place.
Well into the 1800s, a legal formula known as the rule of thumb allowed men to beat their wives as long as the sticks they used were no wider than their thumbs. Courts refused to break into what they called the sanctity of the domestic circle.
The law permits husbands to use such a degree of force as necessary to control an unruly temper and make a wife behave herself. If no permanent injury has been reflected, it is better to draw the curtain, shut out the public gaze, and leave the parties to forget and forgive.
All along, there has been a high level of family violence. Historically, the legal attitude has ranged from complete apathy to complete endorsement. More women now seek treatment in our nation's emergency rooms as a result of domestic violence injuries than from the combination of muggings, rapes, and car accidents, which makes domestic violence the #1 cause of injury to women in this country.
He told me that he was going to beat the fuck out of me, that he was going to take my kids from me to where I would never see them again, and that he would make my life so miserable that I would wish daily that I was dead. I told him that I didn't want to die. And
what was he saying to you?
He told me he was doing it because he loved me.
Just 2 years after making her videotaped accusation, Lisa Bianco was beaten to death by her estranged husband. In America, women are twice as likely to be murdered by former husbands or boyfriends than by strangers. If the video is shocking enough, like this scene of a husband's fatal attack on his ex-wife, it makes it onto evening newscasts nationwide. But the hallmark of domestic violence is that it occurs behind closed doors and gets no attention. No group of Americans is immune to it. Domestic abuse crosses all class lines and affects all races.
Most batterers do not beat up the police officer who gives them a speeding ticket. They don't beat up their boss who yells at them for being late. They beat up their partner and or their children because we let them.
My mommy is having a fight. Is she getting hurt?
Today we know that the great majority of men who beat their wives also beat their children. It is now recognized as the oldest and most common way that American violence is passed from one generation to the next. In a long tradition of taking out aggression on those who are less powerful, children have always been at risk. But in the past, the public preferred to ignore what went on in the privacy of the home. And the media also avoided the subject of child abuse, so that historical reports of family violence are very rare. The first documented case of incest and child abuse appeared in the 1795 memoirs of Abigail Bailey. Published upon her death, Bailey's frank descriptions were a pioneering effort to open America's closed doors. She told in detail how her husband made sexual advances toward his daughter. When he was rebuffed, he became uncontrollably violent.
One day, he fell to whipping her without mercy, striking her over her head, hands, and back. Nor did he spare her face, declaring that if she attempted to run from him, he would whip her to death.
Even though Bailey repeatedly raped his daughter, in the 18th century, prosecuting such crimes was next to impossible. And Bailey, like countless other husbands and fathers, was never brought to justice. Americans don't know how many children have died at the hands of their own parents. Officially, the cause was rarely linked to domestic abuse, and the high child mortality rate caused little social uproar. But in 1874, one story from the streets of New York became the turning point in the history of violence against children in America. It was the case of 10-year-old Mary Ellen McCormick.
There was brought to me the story of a little girl. For years, the child had been a prisoner, very frequently left alone the entire day, locked in an inner room. I saw a pale, thin child, barefoot in a scanty dress. It was December, and the weather was bitterly cold. Across the table lay a brutal whip, and the child's meager arms and legs bore many marks of its use. Her face was the face of a child unloved, that had seen only the fearsome side of life.
In the 1870s, no organization existed to which Etta Wheeler could turn for help. So in desperation, she turned to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. On April 9, 1874, police arrived at the apartment, seized Mary Ellen, and brought her directly to a New York courtroom.
I saw a child brought in, at the sight of which men wept aloud. I saw it laid at the feet of the judge, who turned his face away.
My name is Mary Ellen McCormick. Mama has been in the habit of whipping me every day. I did not know for what I was whipped. I now have a cut on my forehead which was made by a pair of scissors. She struck me with the scissors and cut me.
The story of little Mary Ellen stirred the soul of the city and roused the conscience of a world that has forgotten. I knew where the first chapter of children's rights was being written.
Even though America now admitted to the problem of child abuse, the violence has continued for more than a century. In 1987, no one stepped in to save the life of 6-year-old Lisa Steinberg, even though neighbors had long suspected abuse. Hedda Nussbaum, Lisa's adoptive mother, was also a victim of Joel Steinberg's violent temper, and in the pattern that has gone on for centuries, never cried for help.
Do you recall the thought that I ought to get someone else's advice? This might be serious.
No, I trusted Joel.
Today, 1 in 5 homicides in America occur within the family. And in America, a child is murdered every 3 hours. Child abuse is increasingly recognized as one of the clearest of all contributors to violence in America. If the country is ever going to break the cycles of violence, it will first have to break the cycles of abuse.
When children feel unloved and they're not cared for, if they're treated violently, they're going to develop a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and they're going to feel rage that they would like to take out on someone else in a society. I think now, as people move into the area to examine these things, we discovered that it's epidemic in American society.
In America today, neighborhood gun incidents make the Capone era and the Wild West seem tame by comparison. And half of all homicides are now drug-related. Because so much money can be made, drug dealing in the 1990s has become a deadlier version of what bootleg gin was to the 1920s. it's enormously profitable and enormously dangerous. Today, American violence is much the same as it always has been. We continue to repeat the mistakes of our ancestors. Their violent traditions have become our violent traditions. America still turns criminals into heroes. And just as it was in the days of the James brothers, this country continues its love affair with the gun. The media's obsession with violence has been escalating since the era of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. And it is still true today that violent poor people, fueled by alcohol and drugs, attack each other much more frequently than they attack the rich and privileged. Family abuse is still the primary way that violence is passed from one generation to the next. Of all the characteristics that define American violence, perhaps the most dangerous is this country's historic amnesia, its lack of memory when it comes to violence.
America has suffered from historical amnesia about a lot of issues, and violence is one. The fact that we're seeing a spillover of violence far beyond the most vulnerable members of a society into the middle classes and the upper classes, and the everyday violence is a very dangerous omen as to what awaits us in the 21st century.
Violence is learned, and because it is learned, it can be unlearned, but that can't happen until Americans deal with the roots of their problem. America offers the greatest hope and the greatest disappointment. Until this country takes the first step and sees the pattern of its violent traditions, Americans will be condemned to repeat them.